Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and welcome to the 19th weekly HWbot score roundup. We've got some epic scores to look at today, as basically with every single one of these. Quite a lot of variety in terms of hardware, so yeah, let's get into it. Starting off with OGS's SuperPi 32 million world record on the Core i9 11900K. So SuperPi 32 million is a very old, single-threaded, like CPU plus memory benchmark. It is very, very sensitive to memory latency, and also it just loves CPU clock speed. So it makes sense that, OGS has the world record here with a 7.125 gigahertz 11900K, which is a very, very high frequency for these 11th gen chips, as the cores are very big compared to their predecessors, and so generally they don't clock as high as, say, 10th gen did or 9th gen. So yeah, like you can see that, we have what, like, there's not even 10 of these chips that have hit over 7 gigahertz so far, right? Like there's the number 9 here is at 6.95, so just under 7. And yeah, so OGS pushing 7.125 gigahertz, that is a very, very good CPU, but also just extremely dialed in. And then for the memory, well, for the motherboard, OGS is using a Maximus 13 Apex. They are supported by Asus for motherboards, Crucial for memory, Galax for memory and GPUs. So this right here is actually done with some Galax Hall of Fame memory, as far as I'm aware. Since that right there is Samsung B-Die in terms of timing, right? That's, what is that, 40... Oh man, that's 43... that's 4330. CL12. So yeah, that's insane. Like that right there is that's absolutely ridiculous for CL12. That kind of memory frequency. But yeah, so that right there is obviously some Galax memory, as Crucial doesn't sell Samsung B-Die. Then Thermal Grizzly for the thermal paste, and Be Quiet for the power supply, apparently. Yep, we can see a Dark Power Dark Power Pro in the background there. So yeah, I mean, oh, and then we have a Kingpin T-Rex LN2 pot on the CPU. So actually, I think this is the revision 4, so that's the new T-Rex LN2 pot. So yeah, I mean, like SuperPi 32 million is a very, very difficult benchmark. It's extremely sensitive to memory settings. Also, there's quite a few sort of like software things you can do to improve the performance that also directly lead to worse stability, which is just kind of fun. Though I'm not sure how it works out on Windows XP, but like I've just run it on Windows 10, and 11th gen is kind of convenient in that it actually runs okay on Windows 10 with SuperPi 32 million, but for the world records, you do still want to be using Windows XP because it's just that little bit faster. And then you have various tweaks like Waza. I think there's like virtual memory because, yeah, so SuperPi is like honestly the multi-threaded version for a while there was a multi-threaded version of SuperPi for a long time that was actually a pretty decent memory stress test. So as well as just being really good at measuring sort of memory performance when it comes to latency. Though not latency alone, right? Like that's why we're looking at CL12 at 4330. Though actually, so the funny thing with a lot of memory is that at some point you just hit the limit of what the memory timings can be set to. For example, TRRD, you can't set it lower than 4. So if you want to increase your performance further, you need to raise the memory clock. So contrary to popular belief, running like some crazy low, like running a lower frequency at like CL12 would actually give you worse latency. I mean, at CL10 would give you worse latency than the 4333 CL12 that we're seeing over here. So yeah, and then 6.4 gigahertz on the Uncore, so the CPU is absolutely flying. And then also single-threaded benchmark, so you only run 3 cores and 3 threads to reduce the heat output of the CPU, because any cores that are running, even if they're not running at a very high frequency, because 11th gen does support per core CPU multipliers, even if those extra cores aren't running at a very high frequency, they do still burn some amount of power, and they do add to the operating, like the temperature of the CPU, And on liquid nitrogen, the temperature is actually still a limiting factor. Like if the CPU gets too hot, it's just going to crash anyway. The fact that you have, you know, a container full of minus 190 degrees, 96 degrees Celsius liquid doesn't really change the fact that if the CPU, like the CPU's frequency is still limited by the internal temperature of the CPU. So if the CPU's at, say, minus 150 internally instead of minus 100, minus 155, right, which would be colder, that can actually cause that can still cause it to crash. So that's why you want to disable all of the unnecessary cores for a benchmark like SuperPi. And yeah, and so this is just a, you know, very, very difficult benchmark to run well. And yeah, so world records in this, like this is probably, like this is one of the most competitive benchmarks, I'd say. And at least these days, it doesn't take 6 minutes to find out if you actually got your settings right. It just takes a little under 4. Like if you know, if you're into the sort of top 30, you're waiting just 4 minutes to find out if you got your settings correct. Yeah. So it's no longer stupid long like it used to be. And also here you can really see that difference between 11th and sort of the older generation Intel CPUs, because we had like 9900Ks doing 7.4 gigahertz in this. And now with 11th gen, you know, we're looking at about 300 megahertz less. So yeah, a very, very impressive score from OGS. And also the 11900K is winning this because at this lower frequency than 9th gen because of the IPC increase that 11th gen brought along. So yeah, very impressive score from OGS here. And congratulations to them on that. Let's move on to Splav's 12-core HWbot X265 benchmark 4K. So this is a 4K X265 video encoding benchmark. And Splav took the record in the 12-core category using a Ryzen 9 5900X at 6.05 gigahertz, producing 41.542 FPS. So yeah, like it encodes that many frames of the video in a second. So that's almost watchable. Like that's actually more than watchable at that point. That's, so that's fun. And in terms of the memory settings, we're looking at 1900, so 3800, 14, 14, 28. The thing is, so this looks like basically daily memory timings. But the thing is, on liquid nitrogen, the Ryzen memory controller gets freaking weird. And so this is kind of what you need to do. And it also looks like Splav is actually running this in synchronized memory, which is, or synchronized infinity fabric, though I'm not 100% sure about that. But that is like actually really hard to do with Ryzen CPUs on liquid nitrogen. The infinity fabric on the vast majority of chips, and even on the chips where it does work, like you do need to go through go through quite a lot of work to get it working. It really doesn't appreciate low temperatures. Like one of the first problems you run into with liquid nitrogen on Ryzen 5000 and 3000 series is just like the infinity fabric gets incredibly unstable. And so, you know, getting these kinds of settings to run, which on air cool, like on ambient, this wouldn't really be that impressive. On liquid nitrogen, this is super difficult to do. And then, of course, 6 gigahertz on a 12 core, like a little over 6 gigahertz over on a 12 core Ryzen is just a very, very high CPU frequency in general. I mean, if we look at some of the other submissions, there's only two 5900Xs that have ever been clocked that high. For X265. And also X265 is a rather heavy benchmark. It does take advantage of AVX instructions. I think it actually lists off all of the instructions. Yeah, so you have, like you can see all the instruction sets that it's using. So yeah, AVX, AVX2. It is quite a heavy benchmark. It also doesn't particularly appreciate super unstable memory settings. So yeah, a very, very impressive score from Splav. Now, Splav is supported by ASRock, so he's obviously using an ASRock X570 Aqua, Reactor Threadripper LN2 pot, which unfortunately we don't have a picture of the setup, and then apparently a prototype 2000 watt power supply. Not that you would need it for this specific setup, but for something like multiple RTX 3090s, or even just in a single RTX 3090, a 2000 watt power supply would not be a bad idea. That's from Enermax. And then Thermal Grizzly Cryonaut Extreme. So yeah, like a really great paste for LN2. and then G-Skill Trident Z Royals in dual rank configuration because, 32 gigs of Samsung B-Die. So, yeah, because this benchmark does actually care quite a bit about memory. A lot of the sort of heavier AVX accelerated workloads, assuming that they're not, like the data set isn't so small that it fits into the cache of the CPU, most AVX workloads that actually get into the memory will be memory starved. So, yeah, that like the memory configuration here makes sense, but it's just like running these kinds of settings on LN2 is actually very, very impressive. So, congratulations to Splavon. I think he's reclaiming the record for HWbot X265, as I do believe, yeah, so this is 14 September 2021. Yeah, actually, I think this is straight up a sandbag that he posted after SafeDisk beat his score. Because SafeDisk also posted same day posted, 41.423 FPS, and Splave already had a 41.542 lying around, I'm guessing. But yeah, still like a very, very impressive run of X265 right there. So congratulations to Splave on reclaiming first place in a very short amount of time. Anyway, let's move on to the next score from Splave, because he also, I don't think did he reclaim this? Is this another one where SafeDisk was first for like a couple hours? Okay, no. So now I'm confused, because Splave for a while now has had pretty much all of the like high core count Ryzen world records. And so I'm not sure where this came from, unless I guess this is just the CPU is so good that he expects nobody to be able to get even near it for a while. Or maybe actually he might have. I guess SafeDisk score might have been top in this before. Anyway, yeah, Ryzen 9 5900X, this time at 6.15 gigahertz, which is that's a ridiculous clock speed for a 12 core Ryzen to be at. Yeah, SafeDisk managed a similar frequency, but Splave now beat him on GPU Pi. So GPU Pi is a multi-threaded benchmark that basically just calculates, what is it? This is, how many digits of pi is this? 1 billion digits of the number pi using the CPU. And we're actually looking basically at the same settings as before, but this time with the CPU clocked even higher. So actually, maybe this isn't a sandbag. This might be a new run. But yeah, a very, very impressive score. And the kind of neat thing about GPU Pi is there's actually like adjustments you can make directly in the benchmark to get it to run better on various CPUs. And there's also some stuff going on with the run times for OpenCL, because the benchmark uses OpenCL, and so that's one of the so there's some software tweaks that you can do for this in order to get it to run faster, like just using the correct version of OpenCL for your given CPU. And yeah, so a very impressive score from Splave here for the 5900X in 12-core GPU Pi for CPU, though this is kind of the norm for Splave, because as I mentioned, I wasn't even sure if this was actually a new score. Yeah, I wasn't even sure if this was necessarily, these are necessarily new scores, because Splave has had the records for a lot of the high core count Ryzen benchmarks for a very long time. But still, it's great to see the 5900X being pushed ever further. And then Splave also ran Y-Cruncher Pi 1 billion. Because, I guess SafeDisk beat him for... Actually, this is really old. But, yeah, so Splave has rerun Y-Cruncher Pi 1 billion, 18-core Y-Cruncher Pi 1 billion on the 10980XE, and this benchmark is insanity. Oh, actually, this is one of the places where a 2000 watt power supply would come in very handy. Though I'm not sure that this is actually the 2000 watt power supply, because that looks like a pretty normal, and well, I guess they might be reusing, if it's a prototype, they could be using a regular, smaller models casing. Anyway, yeah, Y-Cruncher AVX512 accelerated benchmark. It's incredibly hot, incredibly power hungry, massively starved for memory bandwidth. So it scales super well with memory performance. And the combination of these factors means that, like, yeah, if you're on a 10980XE with 18 cores, and actually, I guess this CPU is getting so memory starved that it doesn't even make sense to run it with the hyperthreading turned on, which is kind of interesting because yeah, I like that actually, because so hyperthreading has a bunch of memory overhead, because basically if your CPU is shuffling multiple threads around, well, you get memory access overhead, because each thread is going to be like accessing a different part of memory. So if you end up in a situation where, just 18 cores on the CPU are already completely saturating the memory controller, the last thing you want to do is put more threads on that memory controller because it's going to actually end up slowing it down. So that's really interesting because for some of the other X299 CPUs, you actually don't disable hyperthreading. So that makes this benchmark that much more interesting in my opinion. Because, yeah, I've run Y-Cruncher on the 7820X, and there you actually want to keep hyperthreading turned on. But apparently with the 10980XE, you want to turn it off. So that's super interesting. And then other than that, I mean, 3800, 1211 on the memory at 1T command rate, which, fun fact about 1T command rate on X299 is actually it's generally easier to do than 1T command rate on most other Intel memory controllers because it's a different memory controller. So yeah, but the flip side to that is the X299 memory controller doesn't actually clock memory that high. Pretty much the highest frequencies that you would see on like Samsung BDI setups on X299 is around like 4400. And that's really hard. Like even 4200 for a lot of X299 chips is incredibly difficult to do. And then 4400 is just kind of like, well, technically, yes, it can be done. Good luck with that. And that's if you're not really pushing the timings as low as they can go. So obviously here we're looking at 3800, 12, and 1111 because Y-Cruncher, like, it's not just about memory frequency. Like, you need overall memory throughput, and the way you get that is through a combination of tight timings and also high frequency, right, relative to the timings you're at. Yeah, so this right here is just a like ridiculous score, and I'd love to know how much this CPU was pulling running this, because even without the hyperthreading, this is probably pulling close to 1,000 watts, if not more. And also you can see that actually the CPU temperature hit plus 3 degrees Celsius. These chips generally have a cold bug at around minus 110-ish degrees Celsius. So that CPU is pushing a temperature delta of at least 13 degrees Celsius, 113 degrees Celsius, as in the difference between like the LN2, the temperature of the LN2 pot, or yeah, the thing that's cooling the CPU, and the CPU itself is 113 degrees. On water cooling, right, it's pretty normal if you're running a heavy all-core workload that your water cooling loop ends up at like 35 degrees Celsius water temperature, or like somewhere between 30 and 40. If you have a smaller loop with a smaller radiator, you're going to be somewhere, in the 40 range. If you have a bigger loop, you can push it down towards the 30 degrees Celsius range. But if your room's at 20 degrees Celsius, there's no way the water's ever going to be below 20. So if your CPU's at like 90 degrees, right, Celsius, on water cooling, that's a temperature delta of 70 degrees. This is pushing 113, possibly more. I'm just guesstimating the cold bug of this chip. This chip might actually have a cold bug that's even like slightly lower than that. And so that delta could even be maybe 120 degrees, which is insanity. But yeah, this is kind of, when you use every single transistor in the CPU to the absolute limit of its capabilities, you end up with insane power draws and temperature deltas like this. And that makes Y-Cruncher just, like, it is the heaviest multi-threaded benchmark on HWbot, and I'm a big fan of it for that, because it's just really cool. And also, it loves memory performance, so it's kind of a... Because you have some other heavy CPU benchmarks that really don't touch the memory very much. And so I really like the fact that Y-Cruncher it's not just a raw CPU test. It's also heavily dependent on the memory settings. And also, if you're running 3800, 12, 11, 11 for Y-Cruncher, actually just in general, for settings like this, you do need max mem. So yeah, which is fine, because Y-Cruncher, if I'm not mistaken, you only need about 5 gigs of memory, or actually, wait. I'm not sure if if the physical memory readout is equal to the available memory readout. But yeah, so you can actually max mem for Y-Cruncher, but even then, it's way more sensitive to memory stability than a lot of the other benchmarks that you'd ever run on HWbot. So congratulations to Splave on the 18-core Y-Cruncher Pi 1 billion world record, because this is just an insane benchmark to run. And the X299 chips are already insane in like normal benchmarks. And then Y-Cruncher is like a league of its own when it comes to burning CPUs to the ground. Not that I think it actually, I'm not aware of anybody like killing CPUs with Y-Cruncher. I guess, but I mean that in the sense that it makes them run insanely hot, not in that it murders them. Though I would assume if you ran it often enough, the thermal cycling might actually be a problem, especially for, chips with silicon as large as the 10980XE. Anyway, next we have SafeDisk's HWbot, 12-core HWbot X265 benchmark 4K, because I pointed it out earlier, but yes, SafeDisk managed to be... I'm pretty sure he was first for a couple of hours with his 6.034 gigahertz 5900X producing 41.423 FPS on the Crosshair 8 Extreme motherboard. Now, SafeDisk works at Asus ROG, so that's why he's using one of their boards. And dual rank memory with no heat spreaders, because I'm assuming this might like be engineering sample memory straight from G.Skill. Or he decided to take the heat spreaders off, because to be fair, the heat spreaders on the Ripjaws V sticks are kind of not great. So they don't really do much, and then, you just have an easier time insulating if you have bare memory sticks, potentially. Or if you want to mount LN2 pots to your memory sticks, it also makes that a lot more convenient. But anyway, so for the memory settings, we're looking at 3800, 14, 12, 10. So really pushing the timings down there, though the TRC is still at 36, so I'm pretty sure that's no different than running like 14, 12, 12, 24 in terms of performance. At least that would be my experience. Like, I've messed around with the TRP timing, and as far as I can tell, it doesn't do anything unless you actually change TRC. But anyway, yeah, and then also just, 1900 on the memory, 1900 on the Infinity Fabric for 1900 megahertz on both Infinity. Well, actually, I'm not sure about the Infinity Fabric, but still, like, dual rank Samsung B-Die on liquid nitrogen. The Ryzen memory controller gets super weird on liquid nitrogen, so this is hard to run. And then, of course, 6.034 gigahertz. This is a heavy multi-core benchmark, so running that kind of CPU frequency here is, definitely a hell of a challenge. Especially since with Ryzen, one of the best ways to increase the max CPU frequency is to get the chip as cold as possible, but that directly that directly translates into the memory controller and the Infinity Fabric being even harder to overclock. So, yeah, Ryzen CPUs are definitely, like, of the available CPUs on LN2 right now, these are some of the fiddliest CPUs to work with, if you're running any benchmark where the memory actually matters. There's some benchmarks where you can basically get away with not overclocking the memory at all, but if you're running something like X265, yeah, the 5900Xs are very, very difficult to dial in for these kinds of multi-core memory-bound benchmarks. So, congratulations to SafeDisk on the second place in 12-core HWbot X265 4K. And let's move on to the next score, which is MLLR KLLR 88s, also known as Miller. So Miller's Y-Cruncher, 6-core Y-Cruncher Pi 1 billion with a 7800X at 5.1 gigahertz on liquid nitrogen, apparently hitting plus 7 degrees Celsius. Oh, right, because this is on thermal paste. Yeah, that really... So, for those of you who don't know, the 10th gen CPUs, those are soldered. 7800Xs are not soldered. And so what's really annoying on liquid nitrogen, actually, is that... so at ambient, a 7800X is actually sort of great, because you can just whack liquid metal under the IHS, and you get actually better performance than if you had a soldered CPU, because the solder like the solder used for soldering CPUs, it's pretty thick. So even though like the thermal conductivity is really high, it's just not going to rival a super thin layer of liquid metal like you get when you use liquid metal properly. Like, it's a very, very thin layer of liquid metal that you run. So at ambient, actually, the 7000 series has technically less thermal resistance. It doesn't necessarily make it clock higher than the 10 series because the 10 series generally also has better silicon on average. But the thing is, on liquid nitrogen, liquid metal doesn't work because it stops being liquid at around depending on which exact alloy you're using, it stops being liquid somewhere between like minus 15 degrees Celsius and like 5. Some of the alloys actually turn solid really quite high temperatures. And so you can't use liquid metal on liquid nitrogen, and you're stuck using regular thermal paste. Now, and that basically increases the load core to LN2 pod temperature delta because like honestly at this point you might want to have like liquid metal down there, but the thing is at idle it'll just fail. So yeah, so you're stuck running these chips on thermal paste, and that makes things a lot more difficult. Because you just can't get you can't get the thermal transfer that you get with the soldered IHSs of the later CPUs. Then other than that, we're looking at 3800, 1212, 1224 on the memory timings. X299 is actually one of the few Intel memory controllers that allows you to push TRAS below 28. It also allows you to set TRP separately from TRCD, though you don't really see people taking advantage of that very often. And then command rate at 1T, which very easy on X299 with single rank DIMMs, so that's not really surprising. 5.1 gigahertz on that 7800X, and yeah, for Y Cruncher, that's really hard, especially when you have a CPU that has thermal paste under the IHS instead of solder. Also, the die on a 7800X is actually smaller than the die on a 10980XE. So the thermal density, it's not necessarily higher thermal density, but it's not going to be wouldn't be. The thermal density is not going to be super awesome because this is still technically, I believe this is a 10-core die, and then you have 4 cores disabled. So it is going to be lower thermal densities than a 10980XE, but not by that much. It's not as if it's like an 18-core die that got disabled down to 6. And so 32.5 seconds of basically that 7800X pulling as much power as it would ever be able to pull. On an ASRock X290C formula, and this got Miller into second place. And what's super interesting about specifically 6-core Y Cruncher is that the 11600K is actually very competitive in this. For the higher core counts, you really start being limited by the dual channel memory controller on the mainstream Intel CPUs. But at around 6 cores, apparently the CPUs just don't have quite enough memory, like the memory bandwidth disadvantage isn't enough of the cores don't suck up enough memory bandwidth to need a quad channel memory controller just yet. Also, interestingly enough, Dark Gregor was using 6 cores and 6 threads. So yeah, this is a really, there's a lot of stuff you can do with this benchmark. Also, you have the the adjustments to try get the benchmark to run faster, which I noticed that Miller doesn't seem to be doing anything on that. He just seems to have it on auto, which in my experience with Y Cruncher has not been optimal. Though I don't think it made that much of a difference either. Yeah, so still, and it's a very impressive score because X299 CPUs, though this is kind of like X299 Lite when you get to the 6-core. Still, though, this thing has to be pulling stupid amounts of power to push the internal chip temperature all the way up to plus 7 degrees Celsius. Max wattage 378 watts on a 6-core. Actually, do we have a readout for Dark Gregor's power consumption? Oh, we don't. That's a shame. It's a shame. Yeah, but imagine, so 6 cores, that's over 60 watts. Well, no, that's not going to be, because you also have to account for the power of the uncore and the memory controller, but, we're approaching 60 watts per core with a benchmark like this. So, yeah, the power consumption here is just absolutely ridiculous. So, congratulations to Miller on the second place in 6-core Y Cruncher Pi 1 billion. And let's move on to the next score, which is PSK Zor's Cinebench R20 12-core Cinebench R20 third place on the Ryzen 9 5900X at just under 6 gigahertz. And I mean, I've already said, I think enough times just how hard it is to run these 6-core. Oh, wait a minute, you can't do that. You can't save your screenshot with Cinebench dragged halfway off the screen. Pretty sure you can't. Like, even if you're using Benchmate, I am pretty sure you need to have the benchmark still on the screen. So we're just going to check that. You might just have to rerun it. And we're looking at 1800 memory, but desynchronized, right? On-core frequency at 1900. I mean 900, not 1900. So desynchronized memory. Yeah, let's just check that, because, well, if we go over to rules, yeah, benchmark window, full rendered scene and score. Benchmark window, rendered scene, and benchmate score. Okay, I guess that might be fine then, because it says full rendered scene, not like, yeah, okay. So, because well, whatever. I'm not going to get into why those rules exist, but, so this is actually fine. Wasn't really sure about that, because I actually run Cinebench R20 through Benchmate most of the time if I'm doing it for HWbot. It makes submitting so much more convenient. Yeah, I always go out of my way to like organize all the windows so that everything is super visible, and it's like, wait, you can just do this? Okay, well, that makes my life a lot easier. Because actually dragging Cinebench off to the side of the screen so that the render output isn't, well, being visualized, that makes the benchmark run a bit faster sometimes. Like, I've never had that work for me. And though admittedly I've usually tested it with real-time priority, and if you're on real-time priority, the render output doesn't work anyway, because the priority is to actually render the scene rather than display the process of rendering the scene. So you don't see anything until the benchmark finishes, which is super annoying if it crashes, because you have no idea that it crashed, because you can't see anything. Like, you can't even move the mouse when Cinebench is on real time. So it's really, like, you really don't know what's going on if you're using real-time priority. The same kind of issue if you drag it off the side of the screen and run it in, like, high priority, because you still can't see if it's running or not. But, yeah, so that's why he has it dragged off to the side of the screen like this. Using Turbo V Core, which this is like the best OC utility from any motherboard vendor. Like that, this is what motherboard software should look like. It should all look like Turbo V Core. I hate the like overly animated UIs that most of it comes with. Anyway, this is on a Crosshair 8 Impact with that is a rather old Kingpin cooling LN2 pot. That looks like an F1 Dark, which would actually be great for temperature control, because that thing's like super heavy. So yeah, that's a interesting choice of LN2 pot there. And also apparently he got the holes to line up with AM3. Really? Or is that some new bracket for AM4? Because as far as I know, that LN2 pot was only ever made for, like, that's an old LN2 pot. It did not come with mounting hardware for AM3, for AM4. I guess he must have bent the mounting rods or something to get it to line up. They are really long, so that wouldn't really be too much of an issue. Yeah, well, Cinebench is one of those benchmarks that really doesn't care about your memory settings that much, so, running desynchronized and then just 18, 16, 16, 16, 36 still gets you a very, very high score as long as you can get the CPU frequency up there. And that is still, quite a challenge, as Ryzen chips on liquid nitrogen, you want to get them as cold as possible, but the colder you take them, the weirder everything gets, especially the memory controller. The cores actually, no. The cores pretty consistently go faster the colder you get the chip. But sort of everything else on the CPU gets steadily more and more upset as you bring the temperature down. So, yeah, a very impressive score here from PSK Zor on 12-core Cinebench and Cinebench R20. So congratulations to him on that. And let's move on to the next score, which is Lumi's double... Wait, what? Wait a minute. There we go. Bit out of order. Lumi's 3D Mark Time Spy Extreme, third place. And this is single GPU 3D Mark Time Spy Extreme on a Geforce RTX 3090 Kingpin Edition. No system pick, really? Did he at least link the video? No, he didn't. Anyway, Lumi has a video up on his YouTube channel of running this. I'll maybe remember to put a link in the comments or the description to his channel, so you should check that out. Yeah, 3090 Kingpin Edition running 2700 core, 1456 on the memory, which is really high for the memory on a 3090 because the GDDR6X really doesn't appreciate being too cold. It gets very unstable. That's also part of why I wish we had a system picture here. And also Lumi managed to get the highest just GPU subtest score for Time Spy Extreme with the setup here. And the interesting thing is, so 3090s are actually pretty memory bottlenecked, which you can see by the fact that Lumi actually has the highest GPU score in Time Spy Extreme, even though he doesn't have the highest overall score, because the total score is a combination of the CPU score as well as the GPU score. And so you can see here that OGS is getting about, what is that, like 700 points, 600 points more. I know 700 was right. So about 700 more points on the CPU test, but OGS is actually getting a lower score on the GPU test. So Lumi's getting 14243, whereas OGS is getting 14197. However, OGS is running 2850 on the GPU core, but much lower memory clocks. So in this configuration, this 3090 has to be incredibly memory starved, which would be lowering that GPU score, even though your core clock is insanely high. It's just well, it's great that you have all these core clock cycles. It's just a lot of them won't necessarily be used to 100%, to their maximum FPS delivery capabilities if there's no data showing up from the memory, right? There's a balancing act of the GPU needs data to work on in order to actually take advantage of those insanely high clock speeds. And that's a real problem with 3090s and actually quite a few benchmarks, is just once you get them clocked this high on the core, they start getting very, from, 2700 plus or even lower core frequencies. I've not really seen anybody do in-depth scaling comparison between a 3090 at super high core clocks versus how much memory bandwidth it needs to produce decent scores. But the end result is that in quite a few benchmarks, 3090s actually just, you can keep raising the core clock, but the score is not really going to go up that much if you don't have the memory speed to back it up. And so that's how, Lumi here is able to actually slightly, it's not a huge, it's not a huge margin, but slightly beat OGS's GPU score, even though Lumi's running 150 megahertz less GPU core clock because he has a 100 megahertz memory clock advantage. Yeah. And the thing with the memory is it doesn't like being cold, which makes it so hard to run dial in the memory on 3090s on liquid nitrogen. Other than that, also 3090s just pull a stupid amount of power, so they're just very hard to run on liquid nitrogen in general because I do believe they have a sweet spot in terms of temperature that you need to keep it at, and that's the more power a GPU pulls, the harder it is to keep it within a certain specific temperature. And then for the CPU, we've got a W3175X here. Lumi's running this on the EVGA SR3 Dark, and running 3600 1414 28360 at 1T command rate. I don't know basically anything about overclocking a W3175X. It's a very rare CPU. Very weird CPU as well, right? The overclockable 28-core Xeon. And Time Spy Extreme is one of the few benchmarks to truly take advantage of it. Time Spy Extreme is really weird, actually. Time Spy Extreme is one of the only 3D Mark benchmarks that actually scales past 36 threads. Or no, 32 threads. It's even less than that. Yeah. So one of the only benchmarks to scale past 32 threads. And so this is sort of the only benchmark where Threadrippers and the W3175X actually make any sense, because in any other benchmark, say Firestrike, a 5950X is just going to destroy basically any of these HEDT CPUs on the CPU score. as well as bottlenecking the GPU a lot less because of the better just overall single core performance. And then there's other benchmarks where ideally you'd want like a 10900K or an 11900K or a 5950X again. But TimeSpy Extreme, this is truly the benchmark of HEDT CPUs on the CPU portion of it. For the GPU test, it's just a pretty normal. I believe it's rendered at like 4K, but other than that, it's a pretty normal GPU benchmark. Just with a really sort of unique CPU requirement in a way. And it makes it kind of awkward, I think. Because, yeah, it's like, these are like one tricks. Well, I guess you can also run Cinebench and other like multi-core benchmarks on these CPUs, but yeah, like they're not great for any of the other benchmarks. So these are awkward CPUs to have for, well, benchmarking GPUs in general. Yeah, a very impressive score from Lumi here, and I'll link the video I link his video of this score down in the description or in the comments. So yeah, congratulations to him on the first place in 3D Mark TimeSpy Extreme GPU score, as well as third place in 3D Mark TimeSpy Extreme overall. Let's move on to the next score, which is another score from Lumi, which is Lumi's W Prime 1024M. So this is 1.024 billion digits. No, prime numbers. Yes. So this is a benchmark that just calculates a bunch of different prime numbers. And this is in the Core 2 Duo E8500 category. This is a rather old multi-threaded CPU benchmark. Very popular, like, LGA 775 is probably the most popular socket on HWbot. There is a ton of competition for these old CPUs because, well, they're old, they're cheap, and they're easy. They're cheap to bin. They're not necessarily easy to bin. Actually, they're very difficult to bin. As you can see, the spread of frequencies that you see here is quite insane. Like, we have chips all the way. Well, that seems to just be not very well optimized. This is like a low frequency. Also, the benchmark, like W Prime, is one of those old benchmarks that, lots of software tweaks that you can do to make it run faster. And Lumi's really pushing the frequency here, as the previous top score was at just, yeah, like under 6.2, and Lumi's over here, at almost 6.4 gigahertz. So a real, like, that is one really great E8500, and I'm assuming he's running this. Oh, not apparently not a Rampage Extreme, a P5E3 Premium Wi-Fi AP, yeah, I'm actually not sure why you wouldn't, like, well, apparently this board is the best for the E8500. And unfortunately, I don't know much about LGA 775. W Prime doesn't particularly care about memory. So this is apparently, yeah, that makes sense, single channel W Prime. Yeah, I wish we had a system picture. I think Lumi also posted a video for this setup as well, so I'll try link that as well in the comments or the description. So I wish I could give you more details on this, but quite frankly, I know absolutely nothing about LGA 775, and that's very unlikely to change because LGA 775 is so old that I've just decided I am not getting into that. Like, anything older than X58 or Phenom 2s, nope. I'm not touching it. I have enough old junk as is. The last thing I need to do is get into a platform where you need like a variety of different motherboards and and then bin CPUs by the bucket, which is actually what goes into a lot of these, LGA 775 records, because you can actually buy these CPUs by the bucket because they're so damn old and slow. So yeah, congratulations to Lumi on the W Prime 1024M with the Core 2 Duo E8500. Let's move on to the next hardware score, which is White Shark's 3D Mark Skydiver single GPU, 3D Mark Skydiver second place on the Geforce GTX 970. And I feel so bad for White Shark with this score here, because he is, like, that GTX 970 is absolutely flying. Over 2 gigahertz, like way over 2 gigahertz core clock, right? this thing's doing 2140 megahertz on liquid nitrogen. Maxwell is actually really cool on liquid nitrogen. I finally got around to running my Titan X Maxwell recently, and great architecture for LN2 overclocking. Like, it is really, really cool. It clocks insanely high, it scales great with voltage, and it also pulls stupid amounts of power. Though I don't think that's really a problem with the 970, as that's a much smaller chip than the Titan X Maxwell chip that, I was working with. But still, like, an insane overclock. Like, back in the day, GPUs just didn't do 2 gigahertz whatsoever. So this is a very, very impressive overclock for a GTX 970. Actually, I think it might be the highest clock GTX 970 for Skydiver. That wouldn't really surprise me, as the 970, like, the thing is like, you don't see a lot of the super heavy extreme overclocking on the, like, 70 class cards, which is, I think that's a shame, because these are much more affordable, usually. I've realized 3070s do not exist. But yeah, like, 1070s, 970s, 570s. Well, actually, 570s have an insane amount of competition because they're really old. So over time, people have been steadily, pushing them further and further and harder and harder. But yeah, like 670s, 970s, 770s. Actually, 770s have a decent amount of competition as well. 970s are a bit forgotten, I feel like. Anyway, this is, I believe, a Hall of Fame card. Yep, you can see just the sliver of that white PCB right there. So that's a Galax Hall of Fame. I actually have a Hall of Fame GTX 970. Unfortunately, my ASIC quality is trash. It's like 64% or something. It doesn't overclock well. So it's not just like the ASIC quality is bad. It also, like, it's bad and it clocks bad too. Yeah, well, maybe on liquid nitrogen I'll have more luck with it. But White Shark here is, like, really just pushing that 970 to its very limits. And the reason I feel bad for him is because he's only in second place, because Skydiver is unfortunately one of those 3D marks where, if, like, well, actually all 3D marks that have a CPU component do this. But you have a physics score. And the problem with these types of 3D marks is if there's a physics score, and then also if you have a combined score, which basically is a combination of the CPU test and the GPU test at the same time, if your GPU is fast enough, the physics score, like the role the physics score plays in the overall score for the benchmark, gets bigger and bigger. So if you have a GPU that's producing like 52,000 and almost and 449 points, then you really want a CPU that, like, ideally you'd want to be pushing like 60,000 point CPU test or something like way higher than that potentially. And the easiest way to look at this is actually the 3D Mark calculator from Elmore. So if you go here, so I'll actually show this to you. Do we not have Skydiver in there? Well, Firestrike does the same thing. So if, let's say you have, I don't know, 25,000 points GPU score, right? And with that, you should be able to get, I think, around 10K combined. And then you have like a 30,000 point CPU. And okay, so you get a pretty good score. But what if you had a 35,000 point CPU? And that boosts your score quite a bit. What about a 45,000 point CPU? And now you're into the 23,000 point range, right? And 45K is actually very doable with like a 5950X. And this effect gets quite disproportionate. Like if you have a 10,000 point GPU, and then you had like a 45,000 point CPU, you get like 10,000 points. But if you had a 25,000 point CPU, you actually get under 10,000 points. So yeah, White Shark is basically losing this. Like, the thing is, in my opinion, you just don't think about this as a GPU benchmark at that point. You just, like, it's a combined benchmark. Like, it literally has a combined test, which is CPU and GPU together. So, yeah, like, it sucks that, he has this really huge GPU score, and then the physics score is really actually dragging him down, for the overall score, because Samsa Rules here has a slower clock GPU. Yeah, quite significantly slower clock GPU Though it also seems to be hitting. I suspect that 5950X is probably bottlenecking the GPU. Because that is running at like 235 FPS, and this card is running way lower core clocks and producing almost the same GPU score. And that that GPU score is directly proportional to the FPS you're getting. So in order for there to be such a small gap between the GPU scores, like this has to be super CPU bottlenecked on the graphics tests. Though interestingly enough, that combined test is actually also not doing so great. Yeah. So I would guess this is actually getting CPU bottlenecked at this point quite heavily on the first test. Which Ryzen on liquid nitrogen, like, it might not be optimal. I'm not sure. Like, I've not tested this myself. I don't run Skydiver very much, or really like at all. I've used it in the past when I wanted to show test, like demonstrate, or I think there was a video where I was experimenting with using Skydiver to demonstrate like CPU performance bottlenecks on FPS output. But yeah, basically once you're in these hundreds of FPS ranges, you start running into this very funny issue of, you know what, the CPU with more cores might give you a bigger physics score, but it might actually be dragging your GPU like down quite heavily. And Ryzen with the weirdness with the memory controller on liquid nitrogen might actually do that more so with the GPU score, because if you're because the funny thing about the way, say, Windows monitors GPU utilization, I mean CPU utilization, is it doesn't actually distinguish between memory starved and CPU starved, because as far as this operating system is concerned, if the CPU is stalled out waiting for memory access, it still can't really do anything, therefore you're CPU limited. And so yeah, this is a this is one of those interesting situations where it's like, so X299 I guess is the go-to for Skydiver, though I wonder how a 10900K would do, because a 10900K offers way more IPC than a 7980XE or a 10980XE or any of these X299 CPUs. But also with a 10900K, you can run, that's a 20 thread CPU, so it shouldn't really massively limit, it shouldn't tank the physics score like if you were on an 8-core CPU. Right? That's a real problem. It's like if you go down all the way down to an 8-core, you might actually lose too much physics score, even if your GPU score goes up. So yeah, I wonder about that. Like a 10900K might actually be like a 10900K on liquid nitrogen, because a 10900K on liquid nitrogen, we're talking about a CPU that, this is not that heavy a benchmark. You should be looking at 6.5 gigahertz plus quite easily with a 10900K. And at that point, it might be able to keep up with the the physics output of a 7980XE. Oh wait, this goes up to 96 threads. That's interesting. Interesting benchmark. So actually having 18 cores here might actually be helpful, because the funny thing about the 7980XE is there's a bunch of benchmarks where you actually have to turn 2 of the cores off for optimal performance, or entirely disable the SMT. But I mean hyperthreading. But yeah, so congratulations. So also, and the funny thing about having a GPU bottleneck, or more like a CPU limited GPU, is it potentially makes the GPU clock higher than it should, as the GPU is wasting clock cycles waiting for the CPU to do stuff. Though this is still an absolutely insane frequency to run on a Maxwell GPU. So yeah, I do wonder, what is the optimal CPU for Skydiver? And I do have a GTX 970 Hall of Fame, so I should maybe... I should maybe join in on this action. Though getting Skydiver into 3D Mark right now is a bit awkward, as they've removed it from the main suite of tests. If you go to the 3D Mark website, it goes all oh, this benchmark is no longer supported, which is a shame, because this is an interesting problem of what CPU do you use for this? It might actually just be you use X299 anyway. But I do wonder about the 10900K. That might be a good alternative for maxing out the GPU, GPU FPS. Another benchmark that runs into this is Vantage, because Vantage has a CPU test that loves your super high core count chips, But if you actually want the highest FPS, you want like a 10900K or potentially an 11900K, and you end up giving up CPU performance, like you give up your physics score so that you can get a really huge GPU score, and that can actually win you the overall ranking if your GPU score is just way higher than everybody else's. So that makes these combined benchmarks like, when I guess when you're getting into competitive overclocking, that makes these combined benchmarks kind of suck because it's like, oh, I'm losing to somebody who has a worse clocked GPU because my CPU is slow. But at the top end, it leads to this sort of interesting like, what CPU do you use for this specific GPU configuration? And this also applies to some of the like crazy multi GPU setups because like, those have huge problems with CPU overhead. So yeah. Anyway, congratulations to White Shark on the second place in 3D Mark Skydiver. And I wonder if he's going to revisit this because this is a like he's got that 970 absolutely flying. Though I wouldn't be necessarily surprised if he figures out like if he ends up testing this again with like a CPU that I don't know bottlenecks the GPU less because it does look like CPU limited on the graphics score in my opinion. It might actually lead to the GPU clocks dropping just because the GPU utilization goes up. But if your overall score goes up, then a win is a win. But yeah, so congratulations to him on this because that is still an insane overclock. Like honestly, even being able to run GPU Z at this frequency on some 900 series cards is very difficult. So yeah, that is a insane overclock on that 970 and a very solid overall score for the Skydiver GTX 970 rankings. Anyway, let's move on to the next score, which is Chipsy's 3D Mark Firestrike on the Geforce GTX 690. He has beat Salty Croissant, who previously took the first place for the GTX 690 rankings. Chipsy beat him by quite a significant margin on the GPU core clock, which is surprising because most 690s really suck. If you look at the core clocks, like these are Kepler GPUs, and like if you were looking at 680s, even on air cooling, you should be doing over 1300 easy. And then here we have the 690s where we have like chilled water, this is chilled water cooling, yeah, chilled water cooling, and these cards are just about scraping 1410. Or more like Chipsy's card is just over 1400, and then everybody else is way below, like significantly below that. And so yeah, 3D Mark Firestrike 5950X absolutely destroying that physics score because that's what a 5950X does best. Seriously, that is my favorite part of the 5950X is just like I love Firestrike and I love what the 5950X does to the physics score for it. It also does a good job of combined. Like honestly, this is the best Firestrike CPU ever created, at least for now. It would be kind of cool if we had a better alternative to the 5950X in the future. But yeah, so GTX 690, 1400 core, 1872 memory. It's very simple. Chipsy has a card that just outclocks Salty Croissants. Even though Salty actually had a bunch of mods on his card. Well, nah, not really. Like, yeah, it's modified, but this is... Like, I can still see PCB here. It's not just a wall of capacitors. Yeah, Chipsy's actually running a bone stock GPU, and he's also using Vaseline for insulation, which I really don't like. Like, it just makes such a horrible mess, but yeah, insulation's personal preference. As long as I never have to touch that card, I don't particularly care. Yeah, just a like really great overclock on that GTX 690. I wonder what voltage he needs for that. Quick test low volts. So apparently not many volts. Okay. So I guess there might be more room in that card. And yeah, just a very, solid Firestrike result here with the GTX 690. And so congratulations to Chipsy on that. He's actually sort of like he does a lot of GPU benching. So it's not really surprising that, he has he's taken the top score for Firestrike here. I really need to get around to working on that GTX 690 I have. Like, technically, this frequency is doable on air cooling if you're, like, on a 680, this is doable on air cooling if the card is good enough. Obviously, with a 690, you have the unfortunate situation of, like, there's 2 cores on there, so the probability that one of them sucks is, you know, doubled. But on the flip side, I would assume NVIDIA probably bins 690s to not suck as much as the average 680. So yeah, that should be interesting. And I also have a pair of dead 690s that I hope to turn into at least one working one, but we'll see if that ends up being successful. So yeah, congratulations to Chipsy on the 3D Mark Firestrike GTX 690 top score. And let's move on to the next score, which, did I close one of Salty's other? Okay, no, this is the Heaven result, yeah. So Salty Croissant is back with his chilled water cooling loop and 5900X, this time running Unigine Heaven. And this is not an optimal Ryzen benchmark. Yeah, this is like quad core, 4 threads. If you've got an i5, like if Intel was still making quad core 4 thread i5s, like an 11600K, or I guess it would be called like an 11500K. An 11500K, theoretically, would be amazing for something like this, you know, with just 4 cores and 4 threads and all of the IPC and hopefully some massive clocks. Yeah, you could get a really high Unigine Heaven score. Now, the awkward thing, actually, with doing that, though, is that, you know, you need to run something like a 7990, because these days you don't really get motherboards with the GPU, like with the PCIe slot layout for triple GPU. And the awkward thing with that is that 7990s, due to the PLX chip, don't work properly on a lot of motherboards. Now, Ryzen motherboards seem to almost entirely avoid this somehow, where they just kind of run these big multi-GPUs. But yeah, a lot of Intel motherboards, you put a 7990 into them, and they just refuse to initialize the card, which is super annoying. So, yeah, well, that doesn't really affect Salty because he only has this 5900X. And so he pushed this setup to second place. Chilled water cooling, of course. Bone stock 7990 and like HD 7970. Honestly, I am surprised that he needed chilled water cooling for 1155 core. Because my 7990s, like I have a 7990 that does like 1185 on air. And then 1640 on the memory, that's actually pretty standard for 7970s and 7990s. That's not surprising. I'm assuming he has tightened the memory timings, or I guess we won't find out because he hasn't bothered to modify the version string on the BIOS. Like, you can mod the version string on the BIOS of AMD GPUs so that you can keep track of if the BIOS is modified or not. Like, that's why I do it. It's just so that when I boot a GPU, I don't have to sit there wondering, is this a stock BIOS or not? Because, you know, I just look at the version string, and if it says something stupid, it's not a stock BIOS. Yeah, and so Unigine Heaven, when you start pushing like 8,000 plus points, very CPU bottlenecked. So that's why we have this 4-core, 4-thread 5900X pushing, you know, 4.95 gigahertz, as well as the memory doing 2033 on the Infinity Fabric and 2033 on the memory, 1413, 1321 on the timings, TRC of 29, that is really tight, 1T command rate, single rank, because I believe this is actually memory latency limited. Actually, I'm not sure if Salty has a dual rank setup. I think he does. Like, getting dual rank B-die setups these days is quite cheap. You know, you can get like a solid kit of B-die for around $100. So, like if you're this committed to multi-GPU benching, like Salty's been on this roundup so many times with so many different GPU configurations, like you should really have a second kit of B-die if you didn't start with a 4x8. Yeah. Now, the thing is, this is, of course, not the top score. It's second place for the 7970 setup. And what's nice about the 7970 triple is that you can actually use a 7990 in the setup, or you can do this crazy thing with 3 actual separate cards. This was done on a 9900 KS. Yeah, Asus is really good on the Maximus, on the Apex boards, actually supporting a lot of the well, just designing the boards for triple GPU setups, and this is on a 9900KS at 6.4 gigahertz on phase change. What a beast of a CPU. That is insane. Well, also Unigine Heaven. Like, it's funny. It's like you do need the CPU clocked quite high. I'm surprised you didn't go, down to 4 cores, 4 threads. You really don't need 8 of them. And you could potentially hit higher CPU clocks if you only had 4. But, yeah, this benchmark it needs a really high clocked CPU. It doesn't actually put that much load on the CPU, though. So, that's kind of the thing is you can hit insane frequencies. Even on, well, this is a cascade, isn't it? So this thing might be very cold. Oh yeah, this is one very cold cascade. Minus 110 almost. Damn. So that is very, very, yeah, that's a very cold cascade. So yeah, but the thing is like this is super CPU bottlenecked. So 11th gen would actually be very interesting for this. If you find a motherboard that can like actually fit 3 GPUs or get the 7990 to turn on, right? Like that's the unfortunate thing. And then, or if you did find a motherboard that does all 3 GPUs, what you could do is a 7990 and then 2 7970s for a quad setup, because back in the day when GPUs weren't insanely expensive, like when the 7970 was relevant, quad GPU setups were relatively popular. Obviously not super popular, but let's take this score. Yeah. Wait, is this... No, this is single, isn't it? Yeah, this is single. What the hell? 4. I want 4 GPUs, not 1. There we go. So... Oh, they've also disabled points. You've got to be kidding me. I want to see, like, because you can judge how popular a benchmark is from how many points it hands out. So quad. That's actually, I think this person does participate in the rankings, right? Yeah. So this is actually this is one of the more popular quad GPU setups out there. So if you wanted to build something ridiculous for the sake of it being completely ridiculous, 7970s and a liquid, like the CPU on liquid nitrogen. This is back from the Ivy Bridge days, yeah, because this motherboard actually had a PLX chip to run all of those GPUs. This is one of the reasons I get annoyed that none of the modern motherboards have any PCIe lanes, is like, I have a stack of 7970s and 7990s and like all of these Tahiti cards, and it's just like, and now I can't find a motherboard to put them in. Because, yeah, nobody, like, motherboard vendors have collectively decided PLX chips aren't cool anymore, and so good luck finding a board for your crazy multi-GPU setup. Well, at least with the triple setup, like, you can just use the 7990 to do it, but, yeah, otherwise, it's really kind of awkward if you're trying to do quad, because two 7990s don't go into the 7970 rankings. It's only if you have a 7970 and a 799. Like, you can use a 7990 to complement some 7970s, and then it's quad 7970s or like triple 7970s. But if you have two 7990s, that's its own thing. So, yeah, still an impressive score here from Salty Croissant, just like in terms of getting this set up and running on chilled water cooling, though. I'm still really surprised that the frequencies aren't any higher. Then again, I think this is probably so CPU limited that it doesn't make a difference, right? Like if we look at the top score from Pulse, like Pulse is pushing what 1280 actually. That's really well. Lightnings, yep, that makes sense. And that's a 6.4 gigahertz CPU. I'm pretty sure this is entirely like almost entirely down to the CPU performance, because this benchmark runs at like hundreds of FPS. Because Unigine Heaven Extreme, if I remember correctly, it runs at like 1680 by 1050. It's not even a 1080p benchmark. So it really runs at very, very high frame rates. And so when you have these multi-GPU setups, yeah, it just gets insanely CPU bottlenecked. So yeah, great result from Salty Croissant, and also just impressive that, a 5900X is capable of such a high GPU score in this. I wonder how like a regular Intel chip would compare, like not one doing 6.4 gigahertz. Yeah, like 5.5 is not exactly regular. This is clocked lower on the GPUs as well as on the memory. So that's hard. Like, I'd like to see like 5 gigahertz or maybe 4.9 gigahertz Intel versus 4.9 gigahertz AMD Ryzen in Unigine Heaven. That would be like it would be completely useless, but it would be interesting. It's like who has the better CPU for this? Like it would be it would be like a single like a low thread count FPS test rather than an actual like CPU benchmark. So how quickly can you feed the GPUs with just 4 cores? Is it just 4 cores on this one? Yeah, this is 4 cores, 4 threads. So anyway, congratulations to Salty Croissant on the Unigine Heaven Extreme score. I had no idea that the 5900X would be so competitive in this. Because the thing is, the general assumption is just like if you want to do something like this, you need a high clocked Intel CPU. You're not doing it with like a sub 5 gigahertz Ryzen, but apparently yes, you are. So that's cool to see. So congratulations to Salty Croissant on that, and let's move on to the next score, which is another score from Salty Croissant, this time 3D Mark Vantage Performance, with, of course, the 777-970s. I mean, the 7990 and the 7970, and so here you really want a 5950X for this, which really sucks for Salty, because, yeah, like 12 cores, 12 threads. Vantage aggressively dislikes having too many CPU threads available. If you have if you have a 12 core with 24 threads, you got to turn those extra threads off because it costs you CPU it lowers the CPU score. And also, if you turn off the extra threads, you can potentially clock the CPU a bit higher, so that can help the GPU score a bit, because this is another one of those benchmarks that runs at hundreds of frames per second. And actually, this is average FPS. This greatly doesn't show the full picture. The start of Graphics Test 2 runs at like 600 plus FPS if you have enough GPU power. And I think 777-990s or 777-970s would be in that territory of just absolutely stupid frame rate for that first test. And here he's actually running 1185. So I guess for Unigine, he really just did, like, there was no point clocking the GPUs any higher because Vantage is actually heavier. Like, Vantage is generally harder than Unigine Heaven. Though Heaven is a lot, no, they're about the same length, I think. Heaven is 4 minutes and Vantage is like also 4-ish minutes. But yeah, here you'd really want a 5950X or an X299 CPU because with those you can produce like 100,000 plus points in the CPU test. And so, let's see what Pulse 88 was running. Though there's a decent chance this is actually still in the 9900K and it's just getting insane GPU performance. Yeah, this is still, and this is actually 6.1 gigahertz on that 9900KS. But yeah, so you can see like, yeah, very CPU limited, right? Because 6.1 gigahertz CPU getting 103,000 points on GPU score, 97 point CPU score, because, you know, it's an 8 core, so you can still keep your SMT turned on. Whereas with the 12 core, you need to disable the SMT, and so you don't have that much of an advantage in the multi-threaded test, especially against a CPU that's doing 6.1 freaking gigahertz. And then the GPU score, of course, the 6.1 gigahertz 9900KS wins that by not as much of a margin as I initially thought it would. Like, that's only 4,000 points, 5,000 points. It's like a 5% gap for like a 20% clock speed difference, isn't it? Let's pull up a calculator. It's more than 20%. So if we do 6.1 divided by 4.8, like it's going to be 4.825. 4.825. Yeah, so that's a 26% higher clocked Intel chip to produce 5% more FPS. And that's also with a much higher GPU clock as well. So, yeah, Ryzen does really well in these, like surprisingly well in these old GPU benchmarks because, like, for comparison, an X299 chip is actually significantly slower than a 9900K. Because the mesh is horrible for memory latency compared to the ring architecture that the like 9900K and 10900K. 10900K in this is actually really beast because you get that crazy high, you know, single-threaded performance, but you also have 10 cores and get this, 16 threads, because on a 10900K you can disable hyperthreading per core. So for something like Vantage, you don't get the penalty of having too many threads available, but you do get the advantage of just having more freaking cores. And real cores are faster than not real threads, right? Like the hyper-threaded threads, like those are sharing the existing resources in the CPU. It's just better if you have more resources in the first place. So yeah, like a 10900K is actually sort of the optimal CPU for this on liquid nitrogen. Once you have these GPU setups where you're producing, hundreds of FPS. If you have really slow GPUs, then you actually want like an X299 or a 5950X CPU, or like you want like a 10980XE or a 5950X, because you can have your 120,000 CPU score with your 20,000 points of GPU score and really blow up the overall doing that. There is diminishing returns to that. Yeah, so Vantage is a wacky, fun benchmark. I actually rather like the fact that, every time we get it, like what I like about these combined benchmarks is that it gives you an excuse to revisit these old architectures every time a new CPU comes out. You can just go and rerun the Vantage on your 7970s. That's how I justify to myself having a pile of them. Kinda, yes, actually. Anyway, so congratulations to Salty Croissant on the second place 3D Mark Vantage performance with the with the 7990 plus 7970 triple Crossfire setup. Fun fact, you can also put a 7950 in Crossfire with a 7990. Actually, you can put a 280 in Crossfire with a 7990, because AMD's Crossfire, unlike NVIDIA's SLI, just does not care. It will Crossfire will crossfire any two chips that are the same. So like if you wanted to build like the world's weirdest Crossfire setup, what you could do is have like a 7990, an R9 280, and like a 7870 XT, which is a like 15,000 core Tahiti chip. And that'll still Crossfire with a 7970. So yeah, Crossfire is super cool in how flexible it is. Anyway, so congratulations to Salty Croissant on that, and let's move on to the next score, which is Brutek's 3D Mark 11 in entry, and entry top score. And honestly, the only reason I included this score is because look at this thing. This is the only GTX 590 with a proper PCB, because it's the only GTX 590 that doesn't use the trash reference design from NVIDIA. This is the Asus Mars Ii, and as far as I know, they made 500 of them. And these are based on GTX 590, like GTX 590, like these use JF110 cores. So they kind of have a tendency, like I've seen at least one dead one of these already. And it's not because of the PCB failed, as far as I know. It's literally just, JF110, big piece of silicon, thermal cycles itself to death if you run it for long enough, which is really unfortunate that, there's only 500 of them, because, over time, there's going to be less and less working ones. So these cards, whenever they show up on eBay, they just go for insane prices. And you don't really see people run them very much, which is really unfortunate. I guess they all end up in with collectors. So I guess on one hand, the cards are never going to die because they're never going to get run. But then it's like, yeah, they're never going to get run. Either way, this is with a 5300G? Really? What a wacky CPU choice. Oh, I guess this is 3D Mark 11 entry. Yeah. So not really, not like a super popular benchmark for the GTX 590. So Brutek isn't getting the thing is, this is another one of those 3D marks where there's a CPU subtest. So, if actually, let's see if we have a, I'm still surprised though. Yeah, 9900K and 14,000 points. Oh man, that 5300G is doing a lot of work. That's 12,000 points physics score on a quad core. Hot damn. Well, I mean, yes, it's literally currently one of the world's fastest quad cores, but damn, that's actually a lot more. I didn't expect, it's not that far behind. This is a 9900K, right? Yeah, it's not that far behind a 9900K. admittedly, the 3D Mark 11 physics test is very, very memory, like very sensitive to memory settings, and this right here is, honestly, that kind of looks like XMP to me. So that doesn't really, yeah, that's not exactly too surprising that the physics score here isn't much higher than it is, but still, like that 5300G is doing a great job with that Mars 2 card. And then, of course, the Mars 2 just, because it has a proper PCB, actually overclocks properly. So you can run like 800 megahertz core with 1050 on the memory. I would assume you should be able to push that further unless it's cooling limited. Or maybe he just doesn't want to push more voltage into it because, these are really rare cards. Like, that makes these super awkward. Like, if you had one of these, would you actually want to run it full out? They should have not made 500 of them, in my opinion. They should have made like 2,000, several thousand, a couple thousand of them. Because these are really cool. But I'm pretty sure actually NVIDIA probably had a huge issue with Asus even making 500 of these. So we might, like, we're pretty lucky that these exist at all. Because Asus tried to do, like, as far as I know, they wanted to do a 690 Mars. They didn't get permission. They had an engineering sample dual 780 Ti. They didn't get permission. And eventually we just stopped getting dual core cards in general. So, yeah. It's still a shame that there's only 500 of these, as far as I know. Yeah, so 5300G on a Crosshair 8 Hero. Talk about an imbalanced setup. Like, also with potato memory. Like, priorities, man. We've got an insanely rare, dual GTX 580, like GTX 590 slash dual GTX 580. And then just kind of like, oh wait, no, this is an X470 Tai Chi here. Wait, what is going on with this score? Like, that is still an insanely fast GT. Wait a minute. Because there's some other, like, I know for a fact that there's somebody who got a review sample of one of those from Asus. So I want to see how GPU-Z reports that card. Now, if I could just find that score. No, that's a regular 590. Slams, yes. Okay, no, it does report as a GTX 580. But man, like, okay, so that's an X470 Tai Chi, not a Crosshair 8 Hero. I wonder, I guess he must have copy-pasted like an old submission. And that, yeah, because that's very much a Tai Chi. Like, you can see the postcodes, like that's the stupid Tai Chi postcode location. Oh yeah, also this card had 888 pins, but, that's a given. It's literally two GTX, like, it's a GTX 590 without all of the stupid power restrictions, so, that sort of, you kind of need a lot more power connectors for that. Yeah, so a very impressive score from, well, more like very cool card that Brutech posted, because there's a lot of things, like, well, you could run this with a faster CPU. Also, those memory settings right there is just like, that's dragging the physics score down. Like, this 5300G could probably do quite a bit higher physics score, especially since it doesn't even have that much L3 cache compared to the other Ryzens. So it's even more dependent on memory performance than like your regular 5000 series. And still, I wanted to include this because this is a really awesome card. So yeah, anyway, and let's get to the very last score of this roundup, and this roundup is way too long again. I got stuck on the, like, once we get into the hardware side of things, instead of just the global scores, because this is always the sort of like, yay, world records. I love GPUs. I love old GPUs and weird mismatched like benchmark situations where it's like, what CPU actually is going to be optimal for this kind of deal? And anyway, so the last score I wanted to take a look at is this right here. Because Extreme Funky took an RTX 3060 Ti Galax EXOC card, modded it, yeah, the sort of the bare minimum style modifications. That's a memory voltage mod. I'm guessing he has a core voltage mod, maybe? I'm not sure. Can't really tell. Either way, he actually decided to just sort of stand a dry ice, like an LN2 pot full of dry ice on top of the card. Which is sort of what I've been considering doing with my 3060 Ti, but I decided against that when I did like a test fit and just realized, like, my desk is not level enough. It's just going to slide off. And and also it just bends, like, the PCB is just, no, I am not doing that to my card. So yeah, Extreme Funky managed to push the card to apparently 2355, which, unfortunately, he, didn't include the correct time spy link, but he's only averaging like 2141. So I'm pretty sure, and this is admittedly time spy extreme. So I'm gonna try look up his 3060 Ti LHR because he had to post a, like, I'm pretty sure he just forgot to set the validation link. Yeah, Extreme Funky. He's not doing so great on the GPU clock there, considering he's on dry ice. He must be bouncing off the power limit or something, which wouldn't necessarily surprise me. What shunt resistor? We can't see any of the shunt resistors. Oh, this sucks. But anyway, he beat me. And unfortunately for him, he didn't beat me by very much. So my card on air cooling here, mind you, I have a picture of my card doing 13,400 points. Now, I've not been able to replicate that, unfortunately. Yeah, unfortunately for him, that right there is, like, on dry ice, I would have figured a 3060 Ti should be spitting out around 14,000 points, not 13,751. So this really looks to me like it's bouncing off of the power limit, or it's really temperature limited, which wouldn't necessarily surprise me. These things, like, once you start removing the restrictions from a 3060 Ti, these things get incredibly thirsty. I've had my card pull almost 400 watts on the air cooler. Okay, so, like, these things get insanely power hungry, insanely fast. So if this is just on a regular shunt mod, it's probably maxed out the power limit, because I've actually bounced off the power limit on mine, even with the 60, like, even with the shunt mod I have, like, I ended up bouncing off of the power limit. And yeah, we have dry ice for keeping the VRM from exploding, because that's a 6-phase. And evidently that VRM is throwing off so much heat that you're not even getting condensation. Like, you're not getting, like, normally you expect dry ice to just sort of start building up frost on whatever you put it on, but evidently this VRM is kicking off so much heat that the dry ice isn't really achieving much there. Also, that is just, like, the thing is, I want my card to live, because I want to put my card in my daily. Like, if I do something this stupid with my card, like, this is top 10 ways to kill your GPU right here. Like, if that LN2 pot doesn't stay on there, well, he has a proper desk, unlike me. My desk is all curved. Cheap IKEA for miniature. Literally the cheapest desk I could find at IKEA, so I can't really complain about the fact that, like, it's not straight anymore, but yeah, like, if that LN2 pot doesn't stay where it's supposed to be, you are in for, like, a very dead card very, very quickly. And so, yeah, I've just decided I am not doing this to mine, because I like my card working, but I'm still pretty sure that I can actually beat him, at least on Time Spy, because of the whole CPU thing. So this is nowhere near my best CPU score, and as I mentioned, I have actually got my card to spit out 13,400 points. I'm currently waiting for some nice cold weather, like 4 a.m. in the morning, so that I can run the 3060 Ti on, like, stronger than usual air cooling. So we're going to bring up the 3D Mark calculator again. So Time Spy. I've actually gotten that 5950X that I have to spit out 19,600 points. And if I replicate that 13,400 point run, I can do a 14,067. So this is, yeah, so I can beat that. However, Extreme Funky is making a great mistake with his system configuration here, because he does have a 9980 XE. So it's not like I'm bringing, a totally imbalanced CPU to the fight. He's just running his CPU wrong. And so I'm going to regret this, but don't have 36 threads enabled for a 9980 XE. This right here is why that CPU score is so freaking low. Like my 7940X gets a higher CPU score than this because you just disable the SMT. TimeSpy is a new benchmark. However, like 3D Mark Vantage, it has no idea what to do if your CPU has much more than like 20 threads or 24 threads. 24 thread CPUs still get away with it, but 32 thread, 36 thread CPUs, you turn the SMT or the hyperthreading off if you like having a high CPU score, because TimeSpy gets very upset about having too many threads available. So for comparison, like if we go, well, actually, like you can see I have an 18,000 points there for TimeSpy. Yeah, here you have a proper 10980 XE run. Right? Like this is a 10980 XE, 19,000 points easily. This chip's pushing totally bugged out levels of frequency. Everything is bugged out. Lovely. This should be like a 5-ish gigahertz run. Actually, there's probably whoever posted that is probably on HWbot. So I bet if we dig around for a bit, we might find whoever posted that. Wait, can I maybe figure out who posted this from here? Who did this belong to? Nope, that's Extreme Funky's score to 980 XE. No name on this one. Well, that sucks. Nope, that's another 5950X. 10980 XE. Yes, this is how you run your 10980 XE. 4.9 gigahertz, kill the hyperthreading, huge CPU score. Also, push the memory. Push the memory as much as possible. Yeah, that's how you get a proper CPU score in TimeSpy, by removing features from your CPU that you paid for because you don't need them. 16 cores is enough cores, and any more threads than that is too many. So, yeah. Anyway, like great commitment on running the 3060 Ti on just the sketchiest of dry ice cooling. However, yeah, the 99, like the CPU setup here really needs some work. Like you can't run TimeSpy with freaking hyperthreading. And also, for Firestrike, because I'm pretty sure he ran that too. But I don't think he had, like, unfortunately for Firestrike, that's really one-sided in favor of the 5950X. Like, for Firestrike, the 5950X really does reign supreme. Over just everything right now. Yeah. Well, actually, who is this? Midnight. Yeah. So, bam, 44,000 points. So for Firestrike, you actually, if you have a 10980 XE, you actually, or a 9980 XE, any of the 18 cores, you actually want to drop it down to 16. That can help. You might want to check that, but as far as I'm aware, you should drop it down to 16 cores. As Firestrike gets quite upset if you give it too many cores if you have too many threads available again. So anyway, yeah, that is it for this week's HWbot score roundup. This score, I wish I had a spare 3060 Ti. Like, I've already been kind of considering buying a second 3060 Ti so I could compare, like, my modified card versus, say, a Strix as, like, a good, like, a proper design from Asus, compared to like my modified MSI card. And if I did that, then I'd be more than happy to throw the Strix on liquid nitrogen because, well, I'd have two cards, and if one of them dies, I still have a card to stick in my daily system. But at the same time, the 3060 Ti's are not that cheap. So, yeah, and I don't think in terms of, I don't think people would find that content that interesting. So, or more like, yeah, I don't think people would find that interesting anyway. So it seems kind of, wasteful to do that. But there's a decent chance the card would survive it, but it's just like I do actually want a working 3060 Ti at the end of this, so I'm not going to risk the only one I have right now. But I will say that this score has made me really reconsider the whole like, oh, I'm not putting mine on any kind of extreme cooling. The thing is, like, the whole issue with the 3060 Ti is the mounting spacing, because these things have rectangular mounting hardware, which is stupid. Right? Like, if these cards were like, if they just had a square mounting pattern, I'd run it on liquid nitrogen. I wouldn't have any problems with that. But the current situation is like, this horrible like LN2 pot held in place by gravity setup is basically the only way you're getting an LN2 pot onto a 3060 Ti. And it's just like, well, I don't really want to do that. Wait, is he running dry ice in that reservoir? Or is that just a hell of a lot of bubbles? That I really like. That is one thing I've wondered about, is just like using dry ice as coolant, or well, yeah, dry ice slush as a coolant in the loop. Yeah, I'm not. There's not really enough condensation on this for that to be it. So I guess it's just bubbles. Anyway, yeah. So great commitment from Extreme Funky, but like CPU settings are wrong. That GPU score seems really low for the like frequency, like really high peak frequency, and then the sustained frequency isn't there. So evidently, you know, having some issues with the GPU performance because of that. Also, solid memory clock, but you know, that makes sense. He has a memory voltage model over there. And I do wonder, like, does he have a core voltage mod, or is it just on stock voltage? Because that might be part of why the clocks are just kind of all over the place. So anyway, that is actually it for this roundup, and yeah, that went way too long. You know what? I think I might have to split off the hardware part. Because, like, everything was going quite well through, like, this set of scores, and then we get to, like, this, and this, and this, and, well, basically the 7970 setups. And then, of course, we had this over here, and then finally this. Yeah, I think I spent way too much time on these, like this and this. Also some of the earlier scores, but yeah, I'm gonna have to. I guess I'm gonna split off like the hardware specific scores from the world records, or like category scores in the future. But anyway, yeah, that's that. Or I'll just start putting more. Like, the thing is, if I put harsher restrictions on what gets into the roundup, like if I had my way, I would just ditch most of the world records. Like, I like silly GPU setups. I'm sorry. Like, especially since Splave is just like, it's Splave. He has world records. That's what he does. He's very good at it. I don't feel like we need to have that, like, have to have a bunch of Splave top scores every 2-3 weeks, but, yeah, I don't know. Or, well, yeah. Well, maybe if I only did, like, first place scores? I'm not sure. Because, like, personally, I really do find the, like, low-end, like, the GPUs more, like, old GPUs way more interesting. Because, fun fact, pushing the slider around on an expensive high-end modern GPU is exactly as fulfilling as doing it with a GTX 580 or whatever, or 970, or 690, or 7970s, or doing actually with a 3060 Ti, you're far more likely to do something horribly sketchy like this than with a 3090, because at least this will hurt a lot less than a 3090 will if this goes wrong. But anyway, yeah, so that's it. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon. There's a link to that down in the description below. There's also the AHOC Teespring store. It just hit me. It just hit me. I could split this into 2 roundups, where I post one on Sunday, and I post the second one on Monday. I effectively got more content without actually putting any more work into it, because I literally just, like, it's the same scores, just one, like, 40-minute segment, and then another 40-minute segment. And then, you know, people can only watch the part that they're actually interested in. Anyway, yeah, so Teespring store where you can pick up shirts, stickers, posters, you know, the usual YouTuber merch. Both Patreon and Teespring help out immensely with running the channel. Again, I'm, you know, like a second 3060 Ti, hint, hint, nudge, nudge. And so it would be much appreciated if you'd check out the Patreon or the Teespring, because, yeah, it helps out immensely with the channel. And that is it for the video. So thank you for watching, and goodbye.